In this episode, we're going to practice one of the most valuable skills in AI risk work, translating AI risk so executives can act on it without getting buried in technical fog. Brand new learners often assume that if they just explain the technology accurately, leaders will understand the risk, but executives are not looking for a lecture on models or training. They are looking for clear decisions, clear trade-offs, and clear accountability, because they are responsible for outcomes, budgets, reputation, and legal exposure. If you give them too much technical detail, you can accidentally hide the risk inside complexity, and they may walk away thinking everything is under control when it is not. If you give them vague warnings with no structure, you can create anxiety without action, and leaders may either freeze or dismiss the message. Translating AI risk well means speaking in outcomes, using shared risk language, and offering specific decision options supported by evidence. It also means being honest about uncertainty without sounding unsure of yourself, which is a balance that takes practice. By the end, you should be able to describe what an executive-ready briefing contains, how to avoid common communication failures, and how to keep the conversation focused on defensible decisions. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good executive briefing starts with the idea that clarity is a form of respect for the listener's time and responsibilities. Executives are juggling many risks at once, and they need to quickly understand what is happening, why it matters, and what decision is being asked of them. That means you should start with a plain language statement of the situation and the business outcome at stake, not with technical background. You might say that an AI system is being used to influence a customer decision, that it is showing signs of performance change, and that the organization needs to decide whether to tighten oversight or pause automation. When you lead with outcomes, you invite the executive into a decision posture rather than a curiosity posture. Curiosity about technology can be useful, but it is not the purpose of the meeting, and it can distract from risk boundaries. An executive-ready message also avoids jargon unless you immediately translate it, because jargon forces executives to either interrupt and ask questions or pretend they understand. Both outcomes reduce the quality of decisions. The goal is to make the risk legible quickly, so the executive can focus on what must be done. The next element is framing the risk in terms executives already use, which often means likelihood, impact, and exposure. You do not need to provide perfect probabilities, but you should describe whether the risk is increasing, stable, or decreasing and why. Impact should be expressed in terms of harm categories like money, safety, trust, and legal exposure, because those map directly to executive responsibility. Exposure includes scope, meaning how many customers or processes are affected, and speed, meaning how quickly harm could spread if the system behaves badly. This framing helps executives compare AI risk to other enterprise risks rather than treating it as a separate novelty. It also reduces the temptation to debate the technology instead of the consequences. For example, you might describe that the system influences eligibility decisions, affects a large population, and could create unfair outcomes that trigger regulatory scrutiny. That is a risk story an executive can understand and act on. When you deliver risk in that language, you are not simplifying the truth. You are selecting the part of the truth that matters most for decision-making. Another core part of translating AI risk is describing the system's role in the workflow in a way that reveals how much authority has been delegated to AI. Executives need to know whether the AI is advisory, meaning it suggests options, or determinative, meaning it triggers actions with little human review. They also need to know whether the decision context is high impact, such as safety, rights, or legal obligations, because that changes what is defensible. This is where you use the impact classification thinking you learned earlier, but you express it as a practical explanation rather than as a label. You might explain that the AI output is used to prioritize complaints, that a missed safety complaint would be severe, and that current controls rely heavily on the tool's output. That quickly communicates why the risk requires attention. It also invites an executive question that leads to action, such as whether additional human review should be added or whether certain categories should bypass automation. When you translate AI risk well, executives can see where the system sits in the chain of decision-making, which is what allows them to set boundaries. Without that context, leaders may approve a technical fix that does not actually change outcomes. Evidence is another essential element, because executive decisions must be defensible, and defensibility depends on what can be shown. In an executive briefing, evidence should be summarized at a level that supports decisions, such as trends in performance, trends in complaints, monitoring signals, or evaluation findings. You do not need to drown executives in charts and metrics, but you do need to provide enough substance that the risk does not sound like speculation. It is also important to include limitations in a calm way, because evidence is always incomplete, and pretending otherwise can backfire when new information emerges. You might explain that monitoring shows an increase in misclassification rates over the last month, that the increase is concentrated in certain categories, and that the organization has not yet confirmed the root cause, but has identified plausible drivers. That communicates seriousness and transparency, and it sets the stage for a decision to implement safeguards while investigation continues. Executives often respond well to evidence presented as a story with clear signals and clear uncertainty boundaries. When evidence is presented as raw technical output, it can confuse and delay decisions. The goal is to translate evidence into risk meaning. A high-quality briefing also includes options, because executives are decision makers, and presenting only a problem can lead to frustration or denial. Options should be framed as trade-offs, such as speed versus safety, automation versus oversight, or convenience versus defensibility. Each option should include a clear effect on risk and a clear cost in time, resources, or operational impact. For example, one option might be to keep the system running, but add human review for certain categories and tighten monitoring thresholds, which reduces risk but increases workload. Another option might be to pause automation for high-impact decisions until evaluation is improved, which reduces risk but reduces efficiency. Another option might be to restrict use to low-impact scenarios while the organization improves documentation and controls, which protects high-stakes areas but delays value in those areas. These options should be presented in a way that respects leadership appetite and tolerance boundaries, because those boundaries define what choices are acceptable. Executives can then choose based on their priorities, but they can also defend the choice because it was made among structured options with stated consequences. Translating AI risk is therefore not only about explaining risk, but about facilitating defensible decisions. It is also important to address ownership and accountability explicitly, because executives need to know who is responsible for execution and who is answerable for outcomes. A briefing should name the accountable business owner for the use case, the technical owner for operational control, and the governance functions involved in oversight. It should also clarify whether the current governance process approved the use case and whether conditions of approval are being met. If there is a gap, such as missing documentation or missing monitoring, that gap should be stated as a control weakness, not as a personal failure. Executives also need to know what escalation triggers exist and whether they have been crossed, because that affects urgency and reporting expectations. Clear ownership prevents the common pattern where executives approve actions, but nothing changes because the plan is not assigned or tracked. It also prevents finger-pointing after incidents because accountability is recorded and visible. For beginners, this is a key lesson. Executives make decisions, but they do not implement details, so ownership must be part of the message or the decision will not translate into action. A frequent communication failure is using technical jargon as a shield, which can happen even when a speaker is trying to be accurate. When people are nervous, they sometimes explain drift, bias, and model confidence in technical terms, hoping that complexity will signal expertise. The problem is that complexity can also signal that the message is not actionable, and busy leaders may tune out or defer. Another failure is using fear language without precision, which can cause executives to either overreact by banning all AI or underreact by dismissing the messenger as alarmist. A third failure is presenting a long list of risks without prioritization, which makes everything seem equally urgent and therefore nothing becomes urgent. The best approach is to prioritize risks by impact and likelihood and connect them to the business outcomes executives care about. You can also use consistent language such as top concern, emerging concern, and monitored concern to indicate prioritization without sounding dramatic. Translating AI risk is partly about being disciplined with what you say, so the executive can see the signal without the noise. For beginners, recognizing these failure modes helps you communicate with confidence and restraint. Another subtle challenge is talking about uncertainty in a way that does not weaken your credibility. AI systems often involve uncertainty because evidence may be incomplete, causes may be unclear, and behavior may change as data shifts. If you pretend certainty where none exists, you may be caught later and lose trust. If you emphasize uncertainty too much, you may sound like you have no basis for action. The best middle ground is to be clear about what you know, what you do not know, and what you recommend doing while uncertainty is resolved. For example, you can say that monitoring indicates increased error in a specific category, that the organization is investigating the cause, and that you recommend a temporary control change such as additional human review for that category. That approach is both honest and actionable, which is what executives need. It also aligns with risk management, where decisions are often made under uncertainty, guided by impact and tolerance. Executives are used to uncertainty, but they want structured uncertainty, not vague uncertainty. Translating AI risk means packaging uncertainty into decisions, not into confusion. It is also valuable to understand that executives often need a short version and a longer version of the same message, even if you are speaking rather than writing. The short version is the opening that states what the issue is, why it matters, and what decision is needed. The longer version provides evidence, options, and ownership details for those who want to go deeper. If you begin with the longer version, you risk losing attention before you get to the decision. In spoken briefings, you can naturally offer the longer version by saying that you can share evidence and recommended actions, but you still keep the focus on the decision. Another helpful technique is to use consistent phrases that map to executive concerns, like customer impact, compliance exposure, brand trust, and operational continuity. Those phrases act like anchors that keep the conversation in business terms. Beginners sometimes worry this is oversimplification, but it is actually the opposite. It is disciplined framing that respects how leaders think. When you do it well, technical teams and governance teams can still provide detailed backup information, but the executive conversation stays focused on accountable decisions. Because this is an exam-oriented course, it helps to see how translation skill appears indirectly in questions about executive reporting and governance. If a question asks what makes an AI risk report effective, strong answers often include clear impact framing, clear ownership, clear evidence, and clear recommended actions. If a question asks what should be escalated to leadership, strong answers often involve high-impact risk exceeding tolerance, repeated incidents, lack of controls, or major changes in system behavior. If a question asks how to communicate risk without technical fog, the best answer usually includes plain language, linkage to business harm, and structured options. Exam questions also tend to penalize approaches that are either too technical, too vague, or too reactive, because those approaches are less defensible in a real organization. Translation is therefore not a soft skill separate from risk management. It is how risk management decisions actually get made. When you can translate effectively, you make it possible for leaders to set boundaries and allocate resources, which is how controls become real. That is why this topic sits in Domain 1 alongside governance and strategy alignment. To make this concrete, imagine briefing an executive on a vendor AI feature used to summarize customer interactions for support teams. A clear briefing would state that the feature is saving time, but has produced several inaccurate summaries that led to incorrect follow-up actions, creating potential trust harm. It would explain that the issue appears concentrated in certain interaction types, and that the organization's current controls rely on agents noticing errors manually. It would propose options such as requiring human verification for specific categories, adjusting the features used to advisory only, or temporarily disabling it for high-impact customer cases while evaluation is improved. It would name the business owner responsible for support outcomes, the technical owner responsible for configuration and monitoring, and the governance oversight function. It would also state what evidence exists, such as incident counts and monitoring signals, and what uncertainty remains, such as whether the issue is caused by input changes or model behavior changes. This style gives the executive an actionable decision and a defensible record of how the decision was made. It also avoids technical fog because the core story is about customer impact and control gaps, not about model internals. Beginners should see how this structure applies broadly across AI use cases. To close, translating AI risk for executives is the discipline of making risk actionable without dumbing it down by focusing on outcomes, evidence, options, and accountability. A strong briefing begins with the business outcome at stake and describes risk in shared language using likelihood, impact, and exposure connected to harms like money, safety, trust, and law. It clarifies the AI system's role in decision-making, especially whether the AI is advisory or determinative and whether the context is high impact. It summarizes evidence and limitations honestly, then offers structured options with trade-offs that leaders can defend. It names owners and decision rights so actions are implemented rather than discussed, and it avoids common communication failures like jargon overload, fear without precision, or unprioritized risk lists. When you can brief this way, executives can set boundaries confidently, allocate resources intelligently, and support governance decisions that keep AI use responsible over time. This communication skill is one of the clearest ways to translate AI risk knowledge into real organizational control, and it will support everything you do as you move deeper into program operation and reporting discipline.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.